The last type of irrational numbers we're going to put on the number line are those irrational numbers that come from square roots. So square roots of non-perfect squares. I've made myself a list of the perfect squares, some of them, to help me out. And I'm going to need to use them. So these can be read either way. So I could say that 2 squared is 4, or I could say the square root of 4 is 2. Same thing here. 3 squared is 9, but the square root of 9 is 3. I'm going to use these facts to help me figure out what two numbers the square root of 27 comes from. So I'm going to look through my list of perfect squares, and I'm going to find the numbers that are the closest numbers, one that's bigger and one that's smaller. So those are 25 and 36. So I could say that the square root of 25 is going to be smaller than the square root of 27 because 25 is less than 27. And then that would be also smaller than the square root of 36 because 36 is bigger than 27 and that's bigger than 25. Since I know the square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of 36 is 6, I know that the square root of 27 has to be somewhere in between those two numbers, 5 and 6. So it's going to go in between these two numbers on the number line. So we know it's somewhere in here, but we don't know, is it closer to 6, is it closer to 5? So we're going to look at 5.5 right in the middle and see where it would fall in these two spectrums. Like, so where is it? Is it closer here or is it closer here? To figure that out, we need to figure out what 5.5 squared is. And we could like add that to our lists over here. So I'm going to do 5.5 squared. And I'd multiply this out. And I'm just doing this quickly to go through it, and then I add them together. It's 5, 2, 10, 30.25 would be 5.5 squared. So I could say that the square root of 30.25 is 5.5. So where does the square root of 30.25 fall? Well, it goes right here. It's somewhere between square root of 27 and square root of 30. So that means that 5.5 is somewhere in between square root of 27 and 6. So the square root of 27 has to be less than 5.5. So it has to be somewhere in here. It has to be smaller than 5.5. So I'm going to put it in between those two on my number line. Now that's not exactly where it falls, but it's a pretty good estimation of where it is. Let's do that with another problem. So this time we're going to look at the negative square root of 7. We're going to treat it just like the problem above, but at the end we'll think about how that affects our negative numbers. So we need to look at what squares are close to 7. So the closest squares are 4 and 9. So I know that for the square root of 4 is going to be smaller than the square root of 7, which will be smaller than the square root of 9. So the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 7 we don't know yet, and the square root of 9 is 3. Forget I drew that square root, it's just 3. So I'm going to be looking in between 2 and 3 to put my square root of 7. Or on this number line, I'm going to be looking in this region between -3 and -2. It's how many units away from 0 I am. I'm somewhere in here. So I'm going to be thinking about halfway through there and use that as a reference number like I did above. So I'm going to figure out, well, what's the square of 2.5? And then I can figure out where to put it in my list. So off to the side, I'll find the square of 2.5. And my decimals mean it's 6.25. So the square of 2.5, so 2.5 is equal to the square root of 6.25. 2.5 squared is 6.25, or the square root of 6.25 is 2.5. So my list here, 6.25 falls in this region. It's not quite 7 yet, so we're at the square root of 6.25. So I know that the number I want to know about is going to be somewhere in between the square root of 6.25 and the square root of 9. That means that the square root of 7 would be in between 2.5 and 3. In our negatives, everything flips around. So what was biggest now becomes the smallest number when we make it negative. So negative 3 will have to be smaller than the negative square root of 7, which will have to be smaller than the negative 2.5. So the square root of negative 7 actually has to be somewhere in between those two. I don't know where exactly, so I'll just kind of put it in the middle for now, but that is where I'd find the opposite of the square root of 7. So those are some challenging examples, but I'd love if you could go through and give them a shot to see, because this is a superior level question. So just try them out and see how it goes.